This meeting is being recorded.
Great. I think we can start. Swaty?
Start now. Good evening, everybody. My name is Swaty Singh Malik. I'm along with my colleague Mrinalini. We are your hosts for the evening. And on behalf of CLA Africa Hub, in partnership with the Society of Lawyers in India, we would like to welcome you all to today's session, where the topic is democracy working for the world? And a look at why do we need democracy, rule of law, and human rights more than ever before. It's a very interesting topic considering, the circumstance and the situation and the world that we are living in, where even the democratic countries and how many of the people in these democratic countries are truly, satisfied with the way democracy is working. So yes, that's what is going to be about the session is going to be about today. And there's going to be a question answer round right at the end. And you are all requested to share your questions in the chat box. And we'll be taking that up at the end of the session. And now I'd like to welcome Ms. Priya Hingorani, who is a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India. And briefly speaking, she's also been the Vice President of the Supreme Court Bar Association. So we'd like to welcome Ms. Hingorani to come and please share her thoughts.
Thank you, Swaty. Very good evening to everyone. On behalf of the Society of Lawyers in India and the Commonwealth Lawyers Association, it is a great initiative that today we have an all-women's panel and we are going to take the webinar by storm. We am very grateful to Mr. Santhanam Krishnan, who has taken this initiative after the Society of Lawyers in India was formed, which is inspired by very dear Mr. SOLI senior advocate, 2 times he was the Attorney General for India, lover of jazz, and he was very affectionate to all of us, particularly the younger bar. And it is only after when he passed away that this thought came, and the initiative was taken by Mr. Santhanam Krishnan and his colleagues to set up the Society of Indian Lawyers and to hold series of lectures across the world, keeping in mind the initiative of Mr. SOLI and his inspiring thoughts and his work in human rights and on the work on the Constitution of India. On behalf of this Society of Lawyers in India, on behalf of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association, which is holding its next conference in Goa from the 5th to 9th of March. And we're hoping as many friends across the world could join in. We're looking forward. We have a great registration already, and we're looking forward to having many more join us. And not only celebrating the legal profession, the times that we are facing now, but also, networking and bonding with each other. And for that, we're looking forward to having all participants in Goa with us, as many as can join. We also would like to having on the topic which is being chosen for this evening is a very, very important topic as far as the Commonwealth jurisdiction is concerned. It is very important that the countries which are following a democratic process have a relook on whether we are able to follow the norms which are set out under the word democracy. And not only that, whether the people, the citizens of the country are satisfied with the democratic process that we have at the moment, and what needs to be done in case we are failing, and what are and how are the human rights of each individual being affected in democratic countries where we claim to be, the constitutions claim that we are upholding the human rights of the citizens of the country. Having said that, I warmly welcome all of you to this webinar. I warmly welcome you to join us in Goa from 5th to 9th of March. And I would like to personally thank Mr. Santhanam Krishnan and the team for taking this initiative and giving all of us an opportunity to hear Linda Kasonde, who's an eminent lawyer from Zambia and has now recently been elected as the Vice President of CLA Africa Hub. Heartiest congratulations, and over to you, Swathi, to take the proceedings forward.
Thank you, Ms. Hingorani. Our guest speaker for the evening is Ms. Linda Kasonde, and she's a legal practitioner and a civil rights activist based in Lusaka, Zambia. Ms. Kasonde was admitted to Zambian bar in 2001, and she's currently the Vice President for Africa of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. April 2016, she was elected as the first female president of the Law Association of Zambia, a position she held for next 2 years till April 2018. Linda obtained her LLB degree from the University of Leicester in England in 2000 and LLM degree from the University of Cape Town. Ms. Kasonde is a 2017 recipient of the IE University's Extraordinary People Inspiring the IE Community Epic Award in the Women Inspiring Women category. In December 2016, the prestigious The Africa Report named her as one of the people to watch out for in 2017 in Southern Africa. Also in December 2016, she was awarded the Zambia Society for Public Administration's Justice Irene Chirwa Mabeliba Distinguished Award in recognition of her contribution to the advancement of the public service excellence in Zambia. She's now the executive director of a Zambian NGO called Chapter 1 Foundation Limited and the founder of the law firm LCK Chamber. We are very, very delighted and we are very privileged to have you here, Ms. Linda. And please, I would really request you now to carry forward and share your thoughts on this topic of discussion today.
Good evening, members of the judiciary, bar leaders, senior counsel, learned colleagues, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming tonight. It is my great honor and privilege to give this keynote address at this lecture hosted by the Society of Lawyers in India, spearheaded by the indefatigable Santhanam Krishnan, and ably assisted by his colleagues, Mrs. Hingorani, Swaty Malik, and Mrinalini Sen. I would like to start my presentation by telling you a story about why democracy is important at the individual level. On Saturday, the 21st of January, 2023, my friend and comrade at arms, Thulani Masego, was shot dead by masked gunmen while he sat at home with his family watching television. Thulani was a human rights lawyer and a pro-democracy activist in his native Eswatini. Eswatini is a small mountainous kingdom in Southern Africa. It is the only remaining absolute monarchy in the world. In 1973, the previous monarch, King Sobhuza II, repealed the country's independence constitution, which had guaranteed democracy and rights and freedoms. According to one academic, it resulted in the king assuming absolute executive powers and the establishment of a legislature whose members are without a visible constituency. So powerful is this monarchy that until quite recently, few dared to criticize the king, particularly those in rural areas. After King Sobhuza died in 1982, he was subsequently replaced by his then 18-year-old son, who was crowned as King Swaty III in 1986. So began a reign that descended into extravagance and opulence at the expense of the majority poor. According to May 2022 statistics by the World Food Programme, 69% of the Swazi population live below the poverty line, 25% of whom live in abject poverty, and approximately 26% of the population aged between 15 and 49 are infected with the HIV virus. King Swaty's reign is now also known for being increasingly repressive against the demands of many of his people for more democratic institutions to be set up in the country. The last couple of years have seen political upheaval in Eswatini. The Harvard Political Review stated that in June 2021, Spiwe Mkabela had to find the body of her son, Tabeni Nkomonye, a 25-year-old law student at the University of Eswatini, with his eyes gorged out and with 3 holes in it on a field in Tlambeni, Eswatini. A death that was all but confirmed to be at the hands of the police, which gave rise to the unrelenting voice of the people of Eswatini. Protests demanding justice bled into pro-democracy protests, which in turn bled into June 29, 2021, what is now remembered as the Eswatini massacre. A massacre of 80 protesters by the army and police forces. An additional 200 were injured. According to Amnesty International, the human rights situation has deteriorated sharply in Eswatini. The Eswatini government continues to ignore the constitutional provisions on human rights and uses law enforcement and legal instruments to crush calls for justice and democratic reform. What started as a call for an end to police brutality has turned into full-fledged dissent, with repeated calls for political and human rights-centered reform. My friend Thulani was a gentle soul, which belied his steely determination to fight against the lack of human rights and democracy in his native Eswatini, or Swaziland as he preferred to call it. Thulani had spent 2 years as a prisoner of conscience, living in deplorable conditions, serving at His Majesty King Mswati's pleasure. He was released from jail following a massive local and international pressure on the Swazi authorities to release him. Many men would have shrunk from the responsibility of continuing the work that he had started when he was released from jail, but not Thulani. He persisted. If anything, he became more active, not just in Swaziland, but also wherever he saw injustice in the region. Drawing from his past experiences, he offered solidarity to whomever he could, including me when I faced the wrath of the previous Zambian government, who tried to repeal the statute that created the Bar Association in Zambia when I was the president. Thulani was a peaceful man who believed in effecting change through dialogue. It is therefore extremely tragic that he should have died such a violent death. His is one story of many fallen activists who have championed the fight for human rights, the rule of law, and democracy in their countries. Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, once said, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. none pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time, end quote. But what is the state of democracy in the world? According to the Pew Research Center, while most people in the world support the idea of democracy, most are dissatisfied with how it's working. According to a survey done by the Pew Research Center, conducted among 30,133 people in 27 countries between 14th May and 12th August 2018, a median of 51% of the respondents are dissatisfied with how democracy is working in their country. Just 45% are satisfied. According to the study, and I quote, "Discontent varies across regions of the globe. Those in the Asia-Pacific region, for example, tends to be satisfied with how democracy is working in their countries. Only in Japan do a majority say that they are dissatisfied." The Pew study shows that in 6 of the 10 European countries surveyed, half or more say that they are dissatisfied with how democracy is working. Discontent is highest in the southern European countries of Italy, Spain, and Greece, where 70% or more say that they are dissatisfied. In contrast, roughly a third or fewer hold this view in Sweden and the Netherlands. According to the same study, around half or more of the respondents across the sub-Saharan African and Latin American countries say they are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. But what are the causes of this dissatisfaction with democracy? The Pew Research Center reports that, and I quote, "Anger at political elites, economic dissatisfaction, and anxiety about rapid social changes have fueled political upheaval in regions around the world in recent years. Anti-establishment leaders, parties, and movements have emerged on both the right and the left of the political spectrum, in some cases challenging fundamental norms and institutions of liberal democracy." I will now look at each of these issues in turn. Firstly, economic discontent and democratic dissatisfaction. According to the same Pew study, there's a strong correlation between views on the economy and assessments of democratic performance. In 24 of 27 countries surveyed, those experiencing economic hardship are more likely than those experiencing economic prosperity to be dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. In 26 of the 27 nations surveyed, those who believe that their country is one in which most people cannot improve their standard of living are more likely to be dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. Number 2, individual rights and democratic performance. The Pew study also shows that there is a strong correlation between how well people believe that democracy is working in their country with whether they believe their fundamental rights are being upheld. In all of the 27 nations studied, dissatisfaction with democracy is more common amongst people who believe that freedom of expression is not respected in their country. Dissatisfaction with the way democracy works is also linked to people's belief that the judicial system does not adequately protect them. For example, among Hungarians who offer a negative assessment of the country's courts, 68% are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working, while dissatisfaction is just 32% among those who believe that the courts treat everyone fairly. Thirdly, frustration with politicians breeds dissatisfaction with democracy. In all but one of the countries studied, discontent with democracy was strongly linked to the belief that politicians do not care about them, particularly where corruption is rampant. And fourthly, anti-immigration or dislike of the EU and populism are tied to dissatisfaction in Europe. The Pew study shows that while Europeans generally believe that the EU has noble aspirations, such as peace, prosperity, and democracy, they also believe that the EU is inefficient, intrusive, and out of touch with ordinary citizens. Europeans who have a negative view of the EU tend to be more dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in their countries than those who view the EU favorably. The gap is largest in Germany, where those who have an unfavorable opinion of the EU are 43% points more dissatisfied than those with a favorable opinion. Immigration has been a particularly divisive issue in Europe, following the wave of refugees from the Middle East and other parts of the world that have entered Europe since 2015. Across Europe, concerns about how immigrants are not assimilating in the respective countries are linked to democratic discontent. This in turn has fueled support for right-wing populist political parties across Europe. So why is dissatisfaction with democracy a problem? As the saying goes, there's nothing new under the sun. History is often the best predictor of the future. When you look at the major causes of World War II, many of the factors that caused it are present in today's world, such as 1, economic depression, 2, the rise of nationalism and fascism, 3, territorial expansionism, 4, the failure of the League of Nations, which has been succeeded by the UN, and 5, appeasement of politically malevolent regimes. I think that we can all think of current examples of this occurring in the world today. What can we do about democratic backsliding? Here are my recommendations for addressing the shrinking democratic space in any country, based on my own experience of fighting against democratic backsliding in my native country, Zambia. Firstly, on economic discontent. Fight corruption in all its forms, wherever you see it. My country, Zambia, is poverty-stricken and heavily indebted, in large part due to corruption and financial mismanagement of our public resources. On the 17th of May, 2017, 6 Zambian activists, Laura Miti, Bonwo Mwewa, Louis Mwape, Sean Tembo, and Mika Mwambazi gathered at the Parliament buildings to protest against the procurement of 42 fire trucks, which had been purchased at the exorbitant cost of $42 million of government money. The protesters were arrested and prosecuted for over a year for their efforts before ultimately being acquitted. When the few individuals and members of civil society spoke up against rampant corruption and the breakdown of the rule of law in Zambia over the previous 7 to 10 years, those people were labeled unpatriotic fearmongers. Very few people were willing to speak up against the excesses of the former government because it led to ostracization and demonization. But what about the cost of the majority remaining silent? In my view, any austerity measures that Zambians may have to face as a result of the current IMF program is a direct cost of the silence of the majority when it really mattered. Secondly, on individual rights and freedoms, we must all pay attention when the alarm is raised, particularly by civil society organizations. CSOs are often branded as alarmists or unpatriotic by their governments and even the public. However, the telltale signs of attacks on the media, the judiciary, and human rights defenders must always be heeded. Secondly, get the Bar Association and other professional organizations to champion the cause of human rights and the rule of law. And here I include international bar associations, such as the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. Bar associations should try and work with civil society to push back on the shrinking civic space. Thirdly, the judiciary is not necessarily the last line of defense, as it should be in most countries. Ultimately, supreme power vests in the people of any country. Citizens must be educated about their rights and how to seek recourse when their rights are violated. Fourthly, we must express solidarity with human rights defenders. This can not only have a calming effect on those whose rights and freedoms are being assaulted, but also many governments respond to local and international pressure to desist from such actions. And lastly, on this point, we must provide technical and material support to civil society organizations and human rights defenders who are under attack. Most important is legal support to defend human rights defenders and to challenge retrogressive laws. On tackling dissatisfaction with politicians, many countries, particularly in my part of the world, Africa, are struggling to rid themselves of political regimes that no longer care about the welfare of their people. Often, citizens become cynical, believing that there is nothing they can do to change the situation. If there's one thing that politicians fear the most, it is the opinion of the masses. True power resides with the people of any country, and we must conscientize our citizens of this fact. I do not take lightly the risks involved in challenging the status quo, But again, what is the cost of silence? On populism and extremism, this is often driven by fear of the unfamiliar and the sense that there is not enough to go around for everyone. Here, I will refer to the inherently African ethos of Ubuntu. I am because we are. If the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us anything, it is that the problems of this world are interrelated and the solutions to these problems are interdependent. This includes solutions to global problems such as climate change and war. The more we reflect on the universality of human dignity and human rights, the more we will see that we are more alike than we are different. To conclude my remarks, my friend Thulani Masego lives in a country where true democracy does not exist. He was killed in cold blood, fighting for democracy and human rights, things many of us take for granted. The situation in Eswatini, Iran, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and many more countries brings into sharp focus the consequences of the death of democracy. We must all do our part to ensure that democracy is kept alive or resuscitated where it is under threat. I believe that the peace and stability of our world depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, for sharing your wise thoughts. Any questions that you would like to ask?
We have a question from Madhvi Agarwal. If I could read that out. Linda, this is to you. Since and in case democracy, majority of a minority, is not a perfect system, what can be an alternative system to democracy, according to you?
I'll take a few at a time.
There
We
is,
have, yes.
yeah, there's another question. Would you advise nations across the world to create a democratic system that suits the culture, strengths, weaknesses, and specific demographics of a particular country?
I'll take another one.
This is again, Mrinalini, would you like to read?
Sure. Ms. Kasonde, the biggest issue noted in most countries is defiance to court orders, and sincerely, it is difficult to attain democracy. How can we address such issues, especially in our country, Zambia? I think maybe we could start off hearing your thoughts on these three questions as more questions flow in.
Thank you very much for those very interesting questions. I'll take the first one. So somewhere in my presentation, I gave a quotation by Winston Churchill. And what it really means, so the first question was, since democracy is not a perfect system, what is the alternative? So in response to that, I'll refer back to that quotation from Winston Churchill. And just to explain it, it means that even though democracy is not a perfect system, we have yet to discover any system that is better than it. So as has been seen in the survey results that I presented in my presentation, the majority of people in the world do believe that democracy is the best system of government. The challenge has been the implementation of democracy in many countries across the world that is not measuring up to the will and aspirations of the people. And so, as I had set out towards the end of my presentation, I set out how we can address democratic backsliding where it appears. I'll not repeat myself. I'm sure you heard me the first time. The second question is, how would you advise governments to design democracies that suit the culture and situations in particular countries? So I think I alluded to the fact that in my presentation, that I believe that there's a universality to human rights, the rule of law, and democracy in any country. Everybody understands what human dignity means, and those rights must be protected by a constitution. Democracy must also be protected because in whatever system that is created, it must allow for the free flow of the marketplace of ideas. That is, it must promote freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of conscience. I believe that if the marketplace of democracy is allowed to thrive in any country, it will allow the citizens of those countries to access the best solutions to whatever challenges they may have in their particular situations. The situations are different, but the principles are the same, in my view. Lastly, there was a question from a Zambian lawyer about defiance of court orders in our country and what can be done to redress the situation. I think that's an excellent question. With a difficult solution, because it requires every one of us, everybody in the country, to stand up to impunity wherever it exists, whether in the executive arm or in the judiciary. The Law Association of Zambia in 2012 once said that although the judiciary must be respected, they themselves are not untouchable. If they err, they must be corrected. And that can take the form of challenging cases on appeal. It can take the form of public demonstration once the judgment is determined, or even escalation to regional courts that might be more sympathetic. So it's incumbent on every one of us to protect the integrity of the institution of the judiciary, because ultimately that is the battlefield of a lot of political disputes. That is where our human rights must be upheld. So again, the role is on all of us lawyers, it's on every citizen of every country, bar associations, to take charge and ensure that the institution is maintained. Thank you.
There is another question, Linda. Says that some of us have reached the point that Ubuntu has been overshadowed by the emergency of legendary greed on the part of African politicians and the extension, the decay of democracy. The Pope, leader of Catholic Church, is on the African visit, and his key theme is the poison of greed has affected the socio-economic advancement of the African continent. Do you agree with him to the extent that legendary greed is hampering the socio-economic advancement of African nations under democracy?
Thank you. I'll take the next one.
Mrinalini?
I'm still waiting for the questions to come in.
Okay, that's fine. I'll answer this question. So Ubuntu, as I mentioned earlier, is the ethos that I am because we as a collective are. And it goes back to what I was talking about the interdependence of humanity. And I don't think that that ethos has lost its meaning on our continent. I do believe that what leads to politicians running, becoming rogue politicians on the continent is the fact that the people, whether because they're oppressed or because they're fearful of clashing with the government, do not push back when the government is corrupt or shows impunity. I mentioned before that doing so is costly, but if you don't do it, you will suffer the consequences. I myself have, in my work, pushed back on the shrinking space in my country. It's not easy. Democracy is not easy, but you could never allow a situation where impunity reigns in your country. I do understand that many people in many parts of the world, I take, for example, countries like Zimbabwe, Uganda, that I'm familiar with, or even Rwanda, are fearful of reprisal, and it can be deadly. But you have to push back. I believe that the individual brave voices often build a critical mass that eventually leads to liberation. I'll also say that every government, no matter how powerful, as I mentioned earlier, is fearful of the masses. If the masses work together in concert, no government can stop them. If a president like Saddam Hussein can be toppled, there's nothing that can hold a nation back. Thank you.
So Linda, I received a question on my private message. Democracy is dependent on its voters. What can be done, according to you, to make them empowered enough to vote wisely? Do you have any thoughts on that, especially in a country like ours?
Okay, so I often hear the arguments that the reason why democracy is not working so well, particularly in the global south or the lesser developed countries, is because people are not educated. I do not subscribe to that view. I think every citizen knows what they want. Sometimes they don't know how to stand up for themselves or to access their rights or to challenge violations. But I also believe that it's a two-way street. If the governments don't communicate to the people what their rights are, such as basic necessities like healthcare, education, sanitation, and other things, and do not provide access to information that they can use to empower themselves, that is where democracy goes to die. It doesn't depend on education. It really depends on people understanding how they're affected by the issues and understanding what they can do about it. Unfortunately, many of our governments don't perform that role. And unfortunately, again, it's up to people in civil society or other institutions such as bar associations to educate people about their rights as voters and otherwise. So once again, people's ability to vote is such a powerful tool in any democracy. And people really need to understand that it's worth it to vote. So many people don't. I mentioned in my presentation that some people have gotten to the point that they don't believe change is possible. I think, for example, like of a country like Zimbabwe, who have been under oppressive rule for many decades, even after a change in regime. But I believe that people must not tire, because eventually, if people stand in unison, they will see the emancipation that they're looking for.
Thank you very much, Linda. I think we'll end the question answer session now, unless there is. Yes, there is
There's
one
a
last.
question.
Yes, there's a question is, since we are looking at a perspective, what do you suggest apart from dialogue as a way to get more people to work towards a system which works towards the betterment of society across the globe? And there's a second question too, Mrinalini.
Yes, sure. Linda, what will you consider as the parameters of democracy and what will be its yardstick? Will you consider perhaps the ever expansion of human rights as a disadvantage to human rights? It's a trick question, it seems.
I'm not even sure how I'm going to answer it, but I'll give it a stab. So the first question is, what do I suggest apart from dialogue, I think, to get people active in democracy? Was that the gist of the question? I wonder if this person is advocating for violence, because I believe, and indeed my friend Tulani also believed, even in the face of oppression and ultimately his own death, that dialogue is the way in which to meaningfully dismantle any unpopular regime. And if the government is not willing to listen, as was the case in my country under the previous government, then you take the conversation to the people. Again, politicians are very afraid of the masses. The last question was about what I think the parameters of democracy are. What was the follow-up to that?
And what will, I'll repeat, what will you consider as the parameters of democracy and what will be its yardstick? Will you consider perhaps the ever expansion of human rights as a disadvantage to human rights?
Okay, I'll try and take this. The parameters of democracy. I think that so democracy is governance of the people, by the people, and for the people. So I think the only parameter should be, as it is with human rights, that the democracy should not become oppressive, for example, to minorities. Okay, so I think that should be the only parameter. As a general rule, the majority should win, but sometimes the majority is not right. I think, for example, of the Third Reich, where there was massive support for Hitler. And yet, the people of Germany then tolerated the almost annihilation of a people, the Jewish people of Eastern Europe. So that is where the limit of democracy should be. As with human rights, it ends where other people's rights begin. Thank you.
There's one last question. India has had a record of democratic and free elections and peaceful transitions of power, but there remains a need to promote better governance and reinforce democratic practices. Reforms are required to ensure an independent judiciary and an effective legislature, creating checks and balances that can counter corruption and lack of transparency. I would like for you to address on that.
Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, sure.
So I didn't actually see the question. It sounds like a comment.
It is. It's a comment, but the person's asking for your opinion on his comment.
Okay, could you repeat it, please? Sorry.
Zambia has had a record of democratic and free elections and peaceful transitions of power, but there remains a need to promote better governance and reinforce democratic practices. Reforms are required to ensure an independent judiciary and an effective legislature, creating checks and balances that can counter corruption and lack of transparency.
Okay, so it is true that Zambia is often held up as an example of a peaceful and stable democracy on our continent in Africa. And this is because we've managed to change incumbent governments through the ballot box without shedding any blood. I think that whilst we are upheld as a beacon of democracy on the continent, as the run on Capitol Hill on 6th January 2 years ago shows, democracy is never perfect anywhere. And one must always be vigilant against potential backsliding. There's always need to push back because democracy is always potentially under threat. And so we must continue to do our respective parts to ensure that there is transparency and accountability in government, that there is separation of powers between the three arms of government, and that those offices are occupied by good people who uphold the tenets of their institutions. So there's a role for everyone in that, as I mentioned before. We must continue to vote out governments that are not doing their roles. We must continue to speak in between elections. We must continue to speak in between elections so that governments are held accountable in between that time. So I think that is basically my comment. I see something from Sue Clayton. Could you read that, please?
Yes, I would disagree that Zambia has record of democratic and free election, having been a part of monitoring the last two in 2016 and 2021. It's again a comment.
Okay, it's a comment. I think, as I mentioned before, democracy is not perfect anywhere, okay? But the mere fact that we've been able to change political parties through the ballot box, in spite of the weight of incumbency of a government that at times have been extremely powerful. And I think, for instance, of our first Republican president who was in office for 27 years. And the last sort of 20 years of that were under one-party rule. And as powerful as he was, the people managed to change that government through the ballot box. That is amazing in my view. And it doesn't happen very often, certainly not in Africa. So I think that we are an example, and it's happened now 3 times in Zambia. I'm sorry to talk about Zambia a lot. So if there are other people from other regions of the world who want to chip in, I'm very happy to make comments. Thank you.
That's all, I think. And thank you, Linda. Mrinalini, will you please request you to come in?
Sure. Thank you, Swathi. This was a rather unique way for all of us to spend our Friday evening. It has been scintillating to hear the stories of your friend, Thulani Masiho. It's the stories of brave men and women like Thulani that ensure that individuals like us enjoy our democratic freedoms. Linda highlighted the dissatisfaction with democracies that has been felt by people living in democratic countries the world over, in economic inequality or disparity, individual rights and freedoms not being upheld, and frustration with politicians and the political system. Anti-immigration policies are but some of the reasons that have led to the disenchantment with democracy and rule of law. Linda also skillfully highlighted that dissatisfaction with democracy is a lethal concoction when mixed with economic depression and failure of institutions like the League of Nations. The solution for this democratic backsliding, according to Linda, would be to focus on fighting corruption and paying attention and contributing in whichever way all of our citizens can to uphold individual freedoms. Our bar associations, our judiciary, human rights defenders are key stakeholders and need all of our support. Thank you, Linda. You have left us with a lot to ruminate over. Contrary to what democratic pessimists may suggest, authoritarian countries and alternate systems of government have not outperformed their democratic peers. Until we find a better system, I take solace in the fact that democracy at least allows us an opportunity to correct mistakes. And on that note, I wish everybody a warm evening, and I want to thank Priya Hingorani ma'am for joining us today, my colleague Swaty S Malik for hosting this session as well. I also thank Santanam sir and Rahul, who have been the backbone of getting this evening together. Last but not the least, Linda, thank you so much for enlightening us and leaving us with so much to think about. And we're looking forward to seeing all of you in Goa from the 6th to the 9th of March. Good night and namaste to all of you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you, everyone. It was really, really very interesting, Linda. Thank you. A lot of food for thought.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for spending your evening
Thank
with
you.
me. I appreciate
Thank you.
it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.